Welcome back everybody, my name is Tucker, and in today's video I wanted to look back on the 2010 NBA draft and do a complete redraft. So this is just going to be me going through and picking the players that I think were the best out of the class. There's not going to be any context around like the team at the time in 2010 and what they needed. It's just going to be essentially a re-ranking of the draft class as we sit now here in 2020 for their entire careers. But really quickly before we get started, if you enjoy the NBA, then consider subscribing. I upload basically every single day. Okay, here we go. So to make this simpler and easier to follow along with, I've created a pool of, I think this is like 15 to 16 players and where they landed initially in the draft. And we're just going to fill out the top 10 here of the 2010 draft, beginning at number 1 overall. And I think there's a couple of players that are in contention for this, but the more that I thought about it, the more that I realized that the pick here kind of has to be Paul George. When you're looking at some of the other guys that could potentially be here, John Wall is definitely a name that comes to mind. DeMarcus Cousins, potentially, just because of how good he was at his peak. You've got other guys that have been good for longer, like Gordon Hayward. And really, the top of this draft class, one of the themes you're going to see here is players that had pretty high peaks, but for whatever reason haven't been able to stay healthy. And injuries have been an issue for a couple of players at the top of this class. And I think that George is the pick here because last year he showed a near MVP level that nobody else in this class has ever really shown. There's all NBA selections throughout this class, but nobody had really been at the same level that Paul George was last year, and he has been mostly healthy throughout his career, despite obviously the leg injury that he suffered pre-Olympics a handful of years ago, and then the shoulder injuries he was dealing with last year. But comparatively, compared to the other players at the top of this class, he has been healthy and he's had the highest peak, so I'm picking him number 1 overall. Number 2 now is another pretty tough one because again, it just depends on what you kind of what you're grading on. You're grading on an entire career. You're grading on a peak. Are you how much are you discounting for injuries? I'm going to go with John Wall 2nd overall. He has an All-NBA selection to his name. A couple years ago was considered one of the better point guards in the league, and we haven't seen him in a while because of an Achilles injury. He's been recovering from that, but prior to that, he was on probably the best pace out of anybody in this class. And I don't want to discount too much all of those accomplishments just because we haven't seen him in a while. And I think he had one of the higher peaks as well in this class. Moving on now to where I think it gets really, really interesting. Number 3 overall. And for me, when you're looking at this pool, there's 2 guys that could potentially go here. And it's Gordon Hayward and it's DeMarcus Cousins. And the 2 sides to this argument are DeMarcus Cousins was definitely a more dominant player when healthy, when he was at his peak, than Gordon Hayward. But Gordon Hayward has had a little bit more longevity in the league, even though he hasn't been as good over the last few seasons. He was an all-star in Utah and, has had some good moments in Boston, obviously had the injury issues. Both of these guys have missed significant time due to injuries and are not the same players now that they were at their peak. And so it's really tough to differentiate here, and I really don't think you can go wrong. For me personally, I'm going to go with DeMarcus Cousins at 3. And I can understand if you want to argue against that because his teams have never been that successful, but you also have to understand the situation and the circumstances that he was in there in Sacramento. That's a franchise that really hasn't been successful in a long time, so I'm not necessarily putting the losing all on him. Yes, he had more than his fair share of issues throughout his career, but I just think he was a more dominant player at points in his career than Gordon Hayward was, and so I'm going to go with him at 3. And then, of course, I'm going to go with Gordon Hayward at number 4. Overall, has had plenty of team success, plenty of individual success, obviously some injury issues lately that have kind of held him back, and he's still trying to recover from those things, but he's still been good enough to be top 4 for me. So as we look now at our top 4, all of these guys are top 10 picks to this point, but this class, as you look at the pool here, ordered in the order that they were originally selected, there are some really interesting, late first round or even second round or undrafted players as well in this group that are going to be kind of interesting to pick through as we get later on. Next up now, number 5, I think that this selection is pretty much where, there's a significant gap, right? Like you've got Paul George and John Wall, I would say, are in kind of their own tier. Then you've got DeMarcus Cousins and Gordon Hayward as guys that have been good, but they've had some injury issues. And then I kind of put this next guy, Eric Bledsoe, at number 5 overall in his own tier because he's been a good, solid starter. He's been consistent, but never someone that you would really consider to be like an all-star, all-NBA caliber player. Very good player, still has room to grow as well. And someone that is going to continue to have a ton of team success as long as he's in Milwaukee, is signed long-term there. Some of the postseason struggles are a bit alarming, and he wasn't on very many winning teams early on in his career. But I think that it's pretty clear that he is the 5th best player in this class at this point. When you're looking at some of the other names here further down on the list, I think I feel safe in putting Eric Bledsoe number 5. But here's where things, in my opinion, get really, really interesting, because there's a lot of names here that you could kind of put in a different spot depending on what your criteria are. Greg Monroe had a couple of really nice seasons initially in Detroit, and then just was never able to find his footing elsewhere. Avery Bradley was really good with those Isaiah Thomas Boston Celtics teams. Hassan Whiteside has led the league in blocks. He's been one of the better rim protectors in the league, despite what you may think about the rest of his game. Lance Stephenson had a handful of really, really nice moments in Indiana. And then we all know about Jeremy Lin, who turned Linsanity into a pretty solid NBA career. And then you've got role player guys like Evan Turner, Derrick Favors, Al-Farouq Aminu. All of these guys, it's pretty tough to differentiate between. I think it's tough. So in my mind, this is down to Hassan Whiteside or Avery Bradley at number 6 overall. I'm going to go with Avery Bradley just because I think that he does a little bit more to impact winning. When you go back to those Celtics teams that he was on with Isaiah Thomas, he's a really good defender, someone that can score the ball. Obviously, now he's not nearly as effective, but overall, as a career, I think I'd rather have his than Whiteside's, because even though Whiteside had a pretty nice peak and he kind of came onto the scene really quickly, since then it's been kind of shown that even though he's such a good rim protector, your defense isn't necessarily better with him on the floor because he chases blocks, gives up offensive rebounds, things like that. So I think I would rather have Avery Bradley in this spot. And then I'm going to put Hassan Whiteside at number 7 because I do want to respect the success that he does have as a rim protector and that he did have there in Miami for a handful of seasons. And I think that his success has a little bit more longevity than the next player on this list, and that is going to be Lance Stephenson now at number 8 overall. A couple of really good moments in Indiana on an Indiana team that honestly could have made the finals along with Paul George. This would have been a really good class for the Pacers had Paul George stuck around, and obviously Lance Stephenson ended up leaving as well. But when you're considering a guy going 40th overall, jumping up to, in my opinion, the 8th best player in the entire class, not a bad career at all for Lance Stephenson, who by all accounts is a very talented player and has just had other issues in terms of maintaining that success in the NBA. And now we get to really, there's a case to be made for every single one of these guys, right? Like, Greg Monroe never really has found his niche as a role player, but out of all the players left here, had the best peak in those first couple years in Detroit. And then everybody else is pretty much a role player, but they've all been really good, right? Like Evan Turner had a nice Celtics season, turned that into a big contract with the Trailblazers, and then kind of fell off just because of his inability to shoot, kind of needs to have the ball in his hands to be effective. Derrick Favors has been a really good starter to rotation level big for basically his entire career. Ed Davis has been a really good bench big as well. Al-Farouq Aminu, a nice, I want to say 3-and-D player, but not necessarily the best shooter throughout his career, but still a solid player. And then Jeremy Lin as well. I think I'm going with Derrick Favors here just because I will take the volume of the production over a long period of time for his career. And then maybe honestly you could have made a case for him to be higher than this because of the success that he did have in Utah. But I guess, I don't know, I guess I'm saying that I think that Avery Bradley, Hassan Whiteside, and Lance Stephenson had higher peaks than Derrick Favors. Maybe I'm underrating him a little bit here and he should have gone higher, but I feel comfortable having him at number 9. And now we get to 10. And I didn't extend this to like 12 picks or 15 picks just because for most draft classes, it's not going to be terribly interesting who ends up being the 10th best player. This class is a little bit of an exception, but I wanted to keep it consistent when I do this for other draft classes. Number 10, I'm going to go with Greg Monroe, but I honestly I don't feel great about it because there's obviously other players on this list that have had more success over a longer period of time, right? But when you look at Greg Monroe's first couple of seasons in Detroit, and maybe they were fake stats, right? Like maybe they were completely empty, but in terms of his peak, he had a better couple-year stretch than any other player on this list. Evan Turner had some nice moments in Boston, but I don't love what he's done since he's been in Portland. Al-Farouq Aminu has been a nice role player, but Greg Monroe was more than that for a couple of seasons, so I want to give him a little bit more credit for that. And then Ed Davis, even though he's been a really good bench big, I don't want to, put too much stock into that. Jeremy Lin, honestly, probably the biggest contender for this 10th spot, but again, I think that just the peak of Greg Monroe in those first couple years in Detroit kind of overrides everything else, even though he really hasn't been a factor in the league over the last handful of seasons. So there you go. That is my 2010 redraft. This is a really difficult exercise, I promise you. I'm sure some of you guys are going to look at this and be like, man, what is he doing? Why does he have this player here? It really comes down to your own criteria and your own opinion on these things. And there's a lot of different ways I feel like outside of the top 5 things could have gone. I think those first 5 players are pretty solid. Maybe you can change around the order with a couple of guys. I think Paul George is a very clear number 1 overall pick. But once you really get down to the nitty gritty, like, these redrafts are not an easy thing to do at all. I hope you guys enjoyed it. It's fun for me to look back in this way on these classes and really kind of evaluate the full career of these players. And like I said, I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. Let me know down in the comment section below which draft class you would like for me to redraft next, because I plan on doing a couple of these, obviously. And yeah, I thank you all so much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.